On a dark and stormy night, as a tempest was about to unleash upon the least traveled region of Pennsylvania, Mike, a veteran truck driver, was adjusting the mirrors of his trusty truck. He had named his vehicle Old Betty, a tireless companion on many solitary journeys across America's vast highways. With each trip, Mike would dive into the retreat he found behind the wheel, a place where he could forget the trivialities of daily life and lose himself in the miles of asphalt stretching out before him. However, that night, the journey took on a different tone. The heavy clouds not only promised a storm, they seemed to whisper promises of an unusual encounter, weaving the perfect setting for the urban legends that surrounded that part of the road. It was said that the road Mike was about to travel was haunted, a stage for mysterious apparitions and inexplicable events that defied reason and sent chills down the spines of even the most skeptical. Starting Betty's engine, he smiled at the familiar vibration of the steering wheel under his calloused hands. He tuned the radio to a station playing classic rock, and with one last look at the stormy sky, he set off into the unknown, ready to face another night of work under the mantle of rain and mystery that began to cover the road. Mike had carefully planned his route, choosing roads that cut through the heart of Pennsylvania. The objective for this night was clear: to deliver a load of electronic equipment to a small town near the Ohio border. As the night advanced, Mike adjusted the radio volume, trying to find music that matched the rhythm of the rain beginning to drum on Betty's roof. The rain transformed the road into a strip of reflections and dancing shadows, creating an almost hypnotic effect on the eyes of someone who had been driving for so many hours. Inside the truck, the environment was warm and cozy, a stark contrast to the storm roaring outside. Mike kept his eyes fixed on the road, the headlights illuminating the wet asphalt. The solitude of the road, combined with the monotonous sound of the windshield wipers, created an isolated and introspective environment where Mike found a peculiar kind of peace. This trip, however, carried additional weight. The contractor had emphasized the urgency of the delivery, mentioning the critical importance of the equipment for an event happening over the weekend. As the road unfolded before him, Mike reflected on the many miles he had traveled in his career. Each trip was like a page from a rolling diary, full of little stories and reflections that only the loneliness of long distances can offer. That night, however, the feeling was different. There was a foreboding, an anticipation of something imminent and unknown, making his heart beat a little faster with each mile traveled under the stormy sky. At one point in the journey, Mike turned on the signal and maneuvered onto Highway 51, a route known for its long, uninhabited stretches that wound through dense forests and abandoned fields. The rain had intensified, turning the view through the windshield into a blur of droplets and distorted lights. He set the windshield wiper to maximum speed, trying to maintain clear visibility of the road ahead. The wind began to howl around the truck cabin, a ghostly sound that blended with the constant roar of Betty's engine. Mike felt the wind's resistance, gripping the steering wheel tighter as the truck swayed slightly under the stronger gusts. As he progressed along the highway, the lighting became scarcer. Light posts were few and far between, and many were either off or damaged, leaving long stretches of the highway plunged into near-complete darkness. Mike relied solely on Betty's headlights to illuminate his path, each curve and elevation revealing just another segment of the endless night. He knew this part of the trip always required more attention. Stories of wild animals crossing the highway were common, as were reports of accidents caused by drivers who did not respect the adverse road conditions. While driving, Mike occasionally glanced at the side mirrors, the headlights' glow creating illusions of movement at the forest's edges. He tried not to let his imagination run wild, focusing on the concrete reality of the road ahead. Crossing another stretch lit only by Betty's headlights, Mike felt a slight anxiety start to form. He took a deep breath, trying to concentrate on the music now playing on the radio, an old rock song that usually brought him comfort. However, that night, each note seemed to carry an echo of something else, something that waited for him in the darkness beyond the road. As Mike continued his journey along the lonely Highway 51, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Lightning cut through the sky, briefly illuminating the road ahead with an intense, momentary light. It was during one of these quick flashes that Mike first noticed something out of the ordinary. There, on the roadside, a figure seemed to be standing under the torrential rain. The next moment, darkness swallowed it again. Mike blinked, questioning if his eyes were playing tricks on him. He slowed down, straining to keep his eyes on the road while trying to discern if what he saw was real or just a trick of his tired imagination. The truck moved forward slowly when another flash of lightning lit up the sky and the road ahead. This time, Mike was certain. There was definitely a human figure standing by the roadside, wearing what looked like a long, soaked coat, with the hood pulled up, hiding the face. The figure remained motionless, almost as if it were waiting for something or someone. Intrigued and somewhat apprehensive, Mike watched through the rearview mirror as he passed the point where the figure stood. He could still see, out of the corner of his eye, the solitary silhouette in the darkness. A disquieting feeling of being watched began to settle, making the hair on the back of Mike's neck stand up. The next few minutes were tense as he continued driving. The radio now emitted only static, the sound becoming almost unbearable. Frustrated, Mike turned off the device, preferring the sound of the rain hitting the truck's metal. However, amidst the storm's noise, Mike began to hear something else, an almost inaudible whisper that seemed to come from inside the truck. He adjusted the radio volume, thinking he might not have turned it off completely, but the sound continued even with the radio off. The whispers grew, forming words that Mike still couldn't fully understand. His heart beat faster, the sense of something unusual intensifying. Breathing deeply to stay calm, Mike tried to focus on the road. However, his mind was restless, unable to ignore the whispers now seeming to call his name. He glanced again at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone in the back seat, but there was only darkness. Then, a brighter flash of lightning revealed the figure by the roadside once more, now surprisingly closer than before. Mike shuddered, his instinct telling him something was deeply wrong with this situation. The figure seemed to be following him, moving silently and inexplicably in the furious storm. As the road unfolded under the stormy sky, Mike felt a growing discomfort with what was happening around him. Trying to distract himself and perhaps seek some normality, he reached out to turn the radio back on, hoping that the sound of some classic rock music could cut through the tension growing in the air and within him. However, when he turned the knob, instead of music, what came out of the speakers was a mix of static and whispers he had begun to hear earlier. Mike adjusted the controls, turning the dial in an attempt to find a clear station, but every frequency seemed possessed by distorted voices and a hum that made his ears ache. At moments, the static gave way to fragments of voices, as if someone were trying to talk to him through a distant storm. Determined to understand what was happening, Mike increased the volume, leaning closer to the radio, trying to decipher the words amidst the static. What he heard made his blood run cold. "Beware," whispered a female voice, clear and distinct among the interference. "Danger ahead." The voice had an urgent, almost desperate tone that made Mike instinctively look at the road, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the headlights. There was nothing visible except the incessant rain and the asphalt gleaming under the intermittent lightning. The voice continued, repeating the warning, increasingly insistent. Mike felt a chill run down his spine as the words echoed in the truck cabin. Turning off the radio, Mike tried to concentrate on driving, but the voice continued in his mind, insistent and impossible to ignore. He began to question his own sanity. Was he really hearing voices? Or was the exhaustion of the long journey starting to affect his judgment? The howling wind seemed to intensify as Mike advanced along the desolate highway, and each new lightning strike illuminated the landscape in a spectral manner. Focusing on keeping old Betty on the road, he tried to ignore the disturbing whispers still resonating in his head. It was during one of these moments of sudden illumination that Mike saw the figure on the road again. This time, however, it was not just a distant shadow or fleeting silhouette. The woman was right in the middle of the highway, her appearance now clearly visible in the brief moments when the lightning lit her up. She wore a long, soaked coat, and her hair was plastered to her face, outlining the contours of a sad and distant expression. With a quick reflex, Mike hit the brakes, Betty's tires screeching against the wet asphalt. The truck slid a bit, a reminder of the road's dangerous conditions, but he managed to stop a few meters from the enigmatic figure. Mike's heart was pounding, and he was breathing heavily, the adrenaline of the sudden stop mixed with the shock of the sight. Gathering courage, he rolled down the window, the cold rain immediately invading the cabin. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" he shouted, his voice almost drowned out by the storm's noise. The woman did not respond. She just stood there, looking directly at him with eyes that seemed to reflect the storm around them. For a moment, Mike considered the possibility that she was a lost traveler, perhaps a victim of some unseen accident on the road. However, something about her posture and the way she seemed almost translucent under the intermittent lightning suggested she was not just an ordinary person in need of help. Hesitant, Mike turned off the engine and opened the truck door, the cold wind and rain hitting him hard as he stepped out. He cautiously approached, flashlight in hand, illuminating the path ahead. "Can I help you find a safe place?" he offered again, his voice now firmer despite the growing fear. The woman finally moved, but not in the direction Mike expected. Instead of coming towards him, she began to walk slowly to the side of the road, as if inviting him to follow. Mike, driven by a mixture of duty and curiosity, followed her, the flashlight trembling in his hand as he tried to maintain a safe distance. She led him off the highway into the dense forest lining the road. The soaked vegetation and uneven terrain made walking difficult, but Mike persisted, following the mysterious figure as she moved with an almost supernatural grace among the trees twisted by the wind. With each step, the truck driver felt he was moving further away from the world he knew and entering a realm where the rules of reality seemed distorted. Shaped by the storm and the enigmatic presence of the woman, he followed into the heart of the night. As he followed the mysterious woman through the dense forest, Mike began to question his own sanity. The rain soaked his clothes, and the cutting wind whistled through the trees, making each step an effort. The figure ahead moved with surreal agility, gliding almost silently over the muddy ground, her figure partially illuminated by the lightning still tearing through the sky. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the woman stopped at the edge of a small clearing. Mike, panting and soaked to the bone, approached hesitantly, his flashlight trembling in his hands. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of fear and fascination. "What do you want from me?" The woman turned slowly to face him, her eyes shining with an inexplicable light under the storm. For a moment, Mike had the impression they were not alone, that the very air around them pulsed with a palpable, almost audible energy. "They can't hear me," she finally spoke, her voice a melancholic whisper barely rising above the sound of the rain. "But you can see me. You can help me." Mike swallowed hard, struggling to maintain composure. "Help you how?" he asked, the flashlight focused on her, revealing an expression of deep sadness that touched his heart. "There are others," she continued, her voice gaining a bit more strength. Others who were lost like me. They are trapped here, unable to leave this place. We need peace. We need to be remembered so we can move on. Mike felt a chill run down his spine. The idea of spirits trapped in that dark forest, clamoring for release, was something out of the horror stories he loved to listen to in podcasts during his long night drives. However, facing this reality was something entirely different. "How can I help you?" Mike asked, his voice almost failing. He had no idea how to deal with the supernatural, but something inside him, perhaps the same instinct that made him a good Samaritan on the roads, urged him to help. "Help us to be remembered," she replied. "Tell our stories. Don't let us be forgotten in the shadows of this forest." "But I don't know anything about you," Mike protested, feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility being asked of him. "You will know," she said with a certainty that made Mike's heart beat faster. "The stories are here, etched in the trees, in the earth, in the water flowing through the river. Listen to them, and you will know how to help us." With these words, she began to fade, the figure becoming more and more translucent until all that remained was the rain falling gently in the place where she had been. Trembling and utterly stunned, Mike stood in the clearing for a long time, trying to process the surreal encounter. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he turned and began the trek back to his truck, each step echoing with the woman's words. Despite the woman having vanished, Mike felt an invisible force guiding him back through the soaked forest, each step resonating with the weight of his new responsibility. The storm seemed to subside, as if nature itself was paying attention to the mission imposed upon him. The woman's words echoed in his mind. "Listen to them, and you will know how to help us." Returning to the truck, Mike was determined to follow the instruction he had received. He sat behind the wheel, but instead of starting the engine immediately, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts. When he finally started and put the truck back on the road, the rain had turned into a persistent drizzle, and the darkness seemed a little less oppressive. He drove slowly, paying attention to the sounds of the night, to the shapes moving in the shadows of the trees, and to the feeling of the air around him. The road seemed different now, as if each curve and each mile told a forgotten story. Mike found himself slowing down, almost instinctively, near landmarks that seemed insignificant during the day but now pulsed with hidden meanings under the weak light of the headlights. At one point, he stopped completely beside a small stream overflowing onto the road, the sound of running water seeming to speak directly to him. While watching the water flow, Mike felt a strange peace settle over him. It was as if nature was sharing its secrets and trusting him with the stories of those who had been forgotten. He took out his voice recorder, a habit he had of documenting thoughts and observations during his long trips, and began to speak, describing everything he saw and felt. "Tonight, under the storm, something changed," he murmured into the recorder. "This is not just a trip. It is a journey through forgotten memories, through lives that still cry out to be remembered. I don't know how yet, but I will help them. I will tell their stories." With this new purpose, Mike continued driving down the highway, now not just as a truck driver, but as a guardian of lost stories. He knew the road ahead would be long and perhaps lonely, but he was determined to follow the ghost who had chosen him for this task, wherever it might lead. With dawn approaching and the night beginning to give way to the gray light of morning, Mike found a roadside diner and decided to stop. He needed a moment to gather his thoughts and perhaps learn more about the area. The diner, an old establishment that seemed to have been built around the same time as the highway, was decorated with old photos and local memorabilia. After ordering a strong coffee and a donut, Mike struck up a conversation with the owner, an elderly man named Earl, who seemed to know all the stories of the region. Mike subtly mentioned the road and the stories he had heard, careful not to appear overly credulous or unbalanced. Earl, after a cautious look around to ensure no one else was listening, leaned forward and lowered his voice. "You're not the first to mention strange things on that highway," he said, rubbing his chin. "There are many stories that circulate around here. Some say it's the earth crying out. Others talk about a terrible accident that happened decades ago and was never fully clarified." Intrigued, Mike encouraged him to continue. Earl, now a bit more animated by having an attentive listener, began to tell a story about a severe accident on Highway 51 in the 70s, where a school bus full of children collided with a truck on a rainy night, similar to the one Mike had faced. They say the souls of those children never found peace, and they can be seen on the highway, trying to find their way home. Mike felt a chill run down his spine. The story resonated strangely with what the ghostly woman had told him about lost souls needing to be remembered to find peace. He asked Earl if there were more stories, and the old man shared several accounts from local residents who had seen figures by the roadside or heard voices and children's laughter in the middle of the night. Thanking Earl, Mike left the diner with a renewed sense of purpose. He now knew his experience was not just an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern of forgotten memories and tragedies that still haunted that region. Armed with Earl's stories, Mike decided to dedicate part of his time to documenting these narratives and, if possible, helping to bring some resolution to these restless spirits. Returning to the truck, Mike felt different. The dawn brought not only light but a clarity of mission. He took out his recorder again and began to speak, describing everything he had learned, committing to exploring further and understanding what was really happening on that mysterious road. After leaving the diner, Mike continued his journey, now with a new perception of the mysteries surrounding Highway 51. He was more attentive, observing not just the road but also the shadows moving at its edge. As he drove, the figure of the woman he had seen the previous night seemed to completely vanish from his mind, as if it had been just a feverish dream induced by the storm. However, when he passed the same stretch of road where he had seen her for the first time, something unexpected happened. Suddenly, amid the landscape still soaked by the recent downpour, the woman reappeared. This time, she was clearly visible in the daylight, standing by the roadside, looking directly at the approaching truck. Mike hit the brakes, stopping a few meters from her. Incredibly, as he got out of the truck and approached, the woman did not disappear as before. She remained still, her eyes fixed on Mike, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal herself again. Her presence was palpable and real, dispelling any doubts Mike might have had about her existence. "You came back," Mike said, his voice mixing surprise and relief. "Why?" The woman just smiled sadly, pointing to a spot further down the road, as if indicating that Mike should follow. Without words, he followed her gaze, trying to unravel the purpose of this new encounter. His heart pounded with the anticipation of finally understanding what this apparition meant and how he could help solve the mysteries surrounding her. The woman, keeping her gaze fixed on Mike, began to walk slowly towards the stretch of road she had indicated. With a silent gesture, she seemed to invite him to follow her. Without hesitation, Mike followed, feeling that each step brought them closer to some crucial revelation. As they walked, the woman began to speak, her low, melodic voice cutting through the cool morning silence. "A long time ago, this place witnessed a tragedy that was never forgotten by those who left. They are trapped here, Mike, trapped in this piece of land, crying out for someone who can hear them." Mike listened intently, each word increasing the weight of the responsibility he felt. "How can I help them?" he asked, his voice firm despite the uncertainty about how to proceed. "You are already helping," she replied with a sad smile. "By listening, by remembering them. But there's more. You need to tell their stories, share the pain and injustice they suffered. Only then can they find peace. The wind seemed to carry her words, spreading them like seeds in the hope they would take root. Mike felt a resolve forming within him, a determination to carry out the task entrusted to him, not just as a truck driver, but as a messenger for the forgotten. Upon reaching the indicated location, the woman stopped and pointed to the ground. There, among the vegetation beginning to cover the remnants of old asphalt, were marks and signs almost erased by time, but still discernible. "Here," she said, "is where it happened, where many lost their lives. Don't let the world forget them." With these final words, the figure began to fade again, as if her presence were only temporary, an echo of the past that appeared only when necessary. Mike was left alone on the road, the weight of history and duty now entirely on his shoulders. After the woman's figure disappeared, Mike stood for a moment, absorbing the seriousness of his mission. He felt like a guardian of memories, responsible for echoing the voices of those who could no longer speak. Shaking off the trance, he returned to the truck, determined to carry forward the legacy of the forgotten. He hadn't driven long when he saw something on the road ahead that justified the woman's warning. On the asphalt, partially obscured by the morning fog, were scattered debris, remnants of a recent accident. A small car, severely dented, was abandoned on the lane, clearly the result of a violent collision. Instinctively, Mike slowed down and stopped at a safe distance. He turned on Betty's emergency lights and got out to investigate, his heart heavy with the possibility of finding victims. Fortunately, there was no one inside or near the car. It seemed the occupants had managed to escape or had already been rescued. This direct encounter with danger served as a grim reminder of the importance of the ghostly woman's warning. If not for her intervention, Mike could have easily become another victim of the unpredictable circumstances of that highway. Grateful for his safety and motivated by a new sense of purpose, Mike returned to the truck, reflecting on the connections between the previous night's events and the accident before him. He now knew that the stories he needed to tell were not just those of the dead, but also those of the living, whose lives could be impacted by the memories of those who had departed. This understanding reinforced his commitment to speaking about these events, ensuring that neither the lessons of the past nor the warnings for the future would be forgotten. After the events of that night and morning, Mike arrived at his destination feeling transformed. The delivery was completed without further incidents, but his mind was on the lessons he had received on the road. As he drove back home, he reflected on the depth of the experiences he had lived. Mike knew his trip had been more than a physical journey. It had been a spiritual and emotional journey that challenged him to see beyond the visible. He decided to share these stories, not just as cautionary tales, but as reminders of the interconnectedness between the past and the present, between the living and the dead. Upon arriving home, Mike began to document all his experiences in detail, determined to honor the legacy of the forgotten and keep alive the memory of the ghostly woman who had guided him. He committed to being a spokesperson for those who could not speak, keeping their stories alive and teaching others the importance of listening and remembering.